Welcome back to the shop. I'm Jason, and today we're working on this LS swapped BMW, because that's typically what we work on here in the shop. This truck is going to be getting a full front end rebuild, or like 90%. We've got a bunch of parts from Amazon that we're hoping will work because they were hecka cheap, and we'll see what we can get going on this. Let me show you what we got. So what you can see we have here is quite a bit of parts. Hopefully I'm able to get this all done in one day, because that's what I told my friend it would take. We've got a pair of front hubs. We have lower ball joints, upper control arms, inner and outer tie rod ends, pitman arm, and the drop link, or I guess we have a pitman arm and a idler arm in this case. So first things first, we got to get the rig up in the air. And this is a 2002 GMC Yukon with a whole bunch of miles on it and a whole bunch of looseness. So we'll see what else we find while we're under there. So first things first, we're popping the wheels off. We're gonna put some lube on basically everything, and then we'll come back around and start disassembly. What I'm realizing is there are no lower control arms in this kit. That's probably quite a bit more expensive considering it's a torsion arm and you gotta release the tension and everything on that.
Friction is making all the smoke.
Yeah, and the corrosion.
Yeah.
As we get started here, I'm popping the two bolts off of the top of that control arm, holding the brake line to it, and then I'm taking the caliper bracket bolts off and the ABS sensor, and then hanging our caliper up to the side.
Could the hose hold it up?
It could, but it will damage the hose for sure.
Next up, we are taking the sway bar end links out. Then I'm going to use a wire wheel on the tie rod ends to break up all the grease, dirt, and corrosion. That way I can break those free before I need to try to do that on the bench when I don't have the leverage.
Hit my hand on here.
Then that 36 mil on the CV joint is going to come off next. Underneath, we'll pop the ball joint nut off and the tie rod end nut before we start beating the crap out of these guys to get them off.
So before we remove our upper control arm, we want to mark our camber and caster adjustments so that we can try to put them back in the same location. So if there's the remote possibility that the alignment is close as it is, when it goes to the alignment shop next, it will be easier to get in place. To do that, I'm just going to use a little bit of whiteout.
Next up, we're going to start taking apart this upper control arm. There is quite a bit of tension on this control arm pulling down from that ball joint. I think that somebody lifted this truck using the torsion bars rather than a lift kit, which is why it's so tall. Regardless, you're going to have to take off the 13mm bolt holding the brake line to the frame in order to get that forward camber bolt out of there. It was interesting because these bolts only had like 20-30 foot-pounds of torque on them, and they should have about 140. So I imagine that that was contributing to a lack of alignment correction and probably not driving all that great. You can see I struggle a little bit here, then realize I got to take that bolt out to get it out. Next up, we're working on that upper ball joint. This guy was fairly well seized in there, but my ball joint spreader eventually did get it.
Supplying a decent amount of force to that thing right now.
He is tight.
There it is.
With the upper control arm out of the way, it was easy enough to pull it over and slide that CV joint out. You want to protect this joint from excess angle here, so I'm using a strap to hold it up and out of the way. Once we got through with that, it's time to start really working on the lower ball joint. This is a pain in the butt. I did just about everything I possibly could think of, including torching that thing to glowing red, and I could not get it to separate. Both my boys are out here laughing and carrying on with me. And ultimately, it came down to brute force. As we were fighting with this, we decided we better just take this hub off of here, because if we do get it to break free and it falls, that's going to hurt like hell on our feet. This just got 3 bolts on the back, and then if you leave the bolts slightly engaged, you can tap them to push your hub out. This one had quite a bit of rust and corrosion, so that was necessary.
Is it doing anything?
Yeah.
Oh, that's good.
I don't want that. There we go.
There it is.
I didn't want that to break on there.
Yeah,
Well, that's one way to get a ball joint off.
I guess.
So before we can remove the ball joint, we've got these marks here, or these indentations where it's been pressed over to lock it into place. Before we try to push this thing out the bottom, we need to get rid of these. Then we can draw it out with our press.
That worked.
That worked. Ow! That was heavy.
Installing the new ball joint was pretty straightforward. We wound up removing the boot. That way we wouldn't tear or damage it as we were going to install it. Then it was time to get to work on pounding that into the ball joint out. On the ground here with a big sledge, came out no problem. From there we went ahead with the knuckle and we installed the bearing carrier and the heat shield here. We were torquing these down to 133 foot-pounds. And with the help of Judah on the other side to hold this thing in place, we were able to keep it in the vise without going too far, and it was able to be done. It would have worked in the car, but would be very difficult to do with the CV axle in place. On the passenger side here, it was pretty interesting. The forward upper control arm bolt was finger tight and bouncing around all over the place in there. I didn't really cover it here, but I replaced the bolt as well as the alignment camber pins because they had been knocked out with that bolt being loose. Along the way, I'm cleaning everything up so that I've got, well, I won't, but the person that winds up doing the alignment has an easier time adjusting it. I threw just a tiny bit of lube on these as well before I torqued them down. These upper control arm bolts torqued to 140 foot-pounds, and then the upper control arm ball joint to 37 foot-pounds. Installing the knuckle is pretty straightforward. Get your lower ball joint lined up, bolted in place, and then you're going to go ahead, before you do anything with the upper control arm, you're going to slide that CV axle in and push it up and into place. These bearing carriers were really nicely made, and with just a little bit of lube on there for future reference, if you ever need to take this apart, that's pretty important. The thing slid in there, no problem. You can see here with just a little bit of wiggling and fiddling, it went right in. Then I threw the rotor on, and you can see I have the CV joint nut on there. It's not tight yet. One thing to note with suspension components and bushings is it's important to torque them at ride height. The best way of going about that on jack stands or on a lift like this is I made this special adapter so I could bolt up to the hub and I could use my pull jack to twist this corner of the car up until it was supporting the full weight of the corner of the car. You know this when you come up off of the jack stand or off of the lift, in my case here. Once I've reached that point, I can go ahead and I can torque those upper control arm bolts, and they will be in what would be considered close to or technically the ride height. That way you don't torque them down low and then tear them as soon as you put the car on the ground. Then with our control arms and ball joints all torqued up, we move on to reinstalling the brakes. Here you can see that I'm installing these as a complete assembly. I didn't take the caliper off of the bracket. So I'll be torquing the bracket down to 129 foot-pounds, and then the brake line bolts, the 10 millimeters that go up on the control arm, I'm just hitting those with a 1/4 inch impact and giving them a quick and then they're solid. Moving on underneath, you got to pull these splash panels to be able to access the pitman arm and the idler arm. And what I've noticed other people do is they drop the steering box down, which means you got to disconnect the lines. But what I noticed was if you pulled the sway bar out, which is pretty easy without the end links on there, you could probably twist the steering box just enough to be able to get to the pitman arm. So what I did was I took the 2 forward bolts out here and I left the rear bolt in so that it could pivot on that bolt and give me access to the bottom of the pitman arm. You can see here that by twisting the box, it gave me just enough room to be able to get that 36 millimeter nut off of there. I think it was a 36. You'll find out when you're doing this. But I was able to get that nut loose and get my pitman arm puller on there. You will need something like this because it is very, very tight. As you're trying to pull it off, go ahead and put that nut on there, just a couple of threads, so that as you're putting tension on there, it's not going to shoot off and throw your tools at you and make a big mess. Now, I did mark the pitman arm, but it's technically keyed, so it can really only go on in the same place that you took it off. So tighten it back up to the same place that it was before. The torque is 180 foot-pounds to the box. Now I'm going ahead and I'm assembling the idler arm to the idler arm pivot bearing, or whatever this thing is called. Our 74 foot-pounds to the idler arm pivot bearing and 46 foot-pounds to the center link. Before I tried to get the outer tie rods and inner tie rods in off of the center link, I had to scrape all of this debris and everything off of there so that I wasn't going to get the new threads all damaged. And then I also cleaned up the zert fittings on the center link so that I could grease everything up into the new outer tie rods. Now it's going to seem kind of backwards, but what I wound up doing was putting the complete assembly back in the car, torquing the center link to the idler arm and the pitman arm, which was 46 foot-pounds. And then I was able to get those outer tie rods off because the center link being in place gave me some leverage to be able to work that off of there. For reassembly of your inner and outer tie rods, you want to first put some grease through that center link to make sure that your zert fitting is working, then clean the old grease out that you just squirted through there. Then you're going to go ahead and install your inner tie rod. You can put a little bit of blue Loctite on there. I didn't. There was no blue Loctite on the old one, but I've seen some recommendations for it. And then if you can torque it, it's best to try to torque it. In this case, with it on the car, I didn't have the means to do so. So with this pipe wrench here, I got it really tight. Then I filled up that joint with grease and slid the boot back over. My outer tie rods were very different left to right. So I couldn't just take the measurements that was there before and throw it back on the car. What I wound up doing was taking those measurements, adding them together, dividing by 2, and splitting it. And then once I got the car all tightened down and torqued, what I did was I eyeball aligned the left and right side. So the front tire to the back, front tire to the back. And I got it really, really close. So close that when I went out and I test drove the car, it actually drove straight with the steering wheel in the middle. Now, the steering box on this car did have a bit of play, which left the steering wheel a little bit loose still. You would think that all of these parts would stiffen it up, it'd be brand new. Not exactly the case. That steering box is a big point in the system, plus the steering shaft down from the steering wheel. Either way, it did come out great and drove much better than it did on its way into the shop here. Rounding out our install here, we're replacing the sway bar bushings. The kit came with the end links, but it didn't come with new bushings, so we picked up a set at a local parts house and got those installed. Then, like I said, we went ahead and did an eyeball alignment. I know that there are ways to do string alignments and things like that. This car was going from my shop to an alignment place to get all taken care of. At the end of the day, like I said before, it drove great and it worked out really well. So I really appreciate you watching. Like, subscribe, comment. Let me know if this style format is better than my typical style where I'm more teaching and talking along the way versus the voiceover where I talk about what I was doing while I was doing it. Again, really appreciate you watching, and I'll see you right here in the shop in the next one.